To all the Montreal Quebecers who are going out there and asking the question, hey, first overall, Wright or Slafkovsky, or maybe Cooley, or maybe even a defenseman, who the heck is it that the Habs are going to draft first? Let's go over onto an interview that none other than Jack Hughes' father, Kent Hughes, did with Frank Seravalli on Daily Faceoff. This happened on the DFO Rundown show a few days ago, and for anybody that was actually getting a bit worried about the pick and the first overall and what they're going to do with it, etc., this interview might have just gone out there and been your holy Bible in this entire situation, because what Kent Hughes said, while he didn't directly confirm anything, he pretty much alluded to a few ideas that I think spell out very reasonable conclusions for the Canadiens heading towards next week's draft. And it's kind of weird that I said next week's draft, because I just kind of realized, oh crap, the draft is next week. Ay. Time's moving by quickly, isn't it? It's already June 28th, and now it's almost July. My goodness. So this video will be linked in the description below if you want to go ahead and watch it. An interview with Montreal Canadiens GM Kent Hughes, done by, of course, the Daily Faceoff crew, Frank Seravalli of DFO Rundown. We'll also link in the description a Reddit post. This is what that's Ollie Horn. That's what it is, yeah. Posted on the sub. What they did was they pretty much compiled everything that Kent Hughes said and condensed it into a too long didn't listen, so you can actually just read along what it was that Kent Hughes had to say about the draft, his son, the first overall pick, the Habs plans, etc. So big shout out over here to Ollie Horn on Reddit, who went out there and summarized it. Let's go over what they wrote about in the comments and pretty much hear from Kent Hughes himself what the draft is going to be like for this team. Kent started off the interview talking about the past year and how surreal it's been and emotional with Lafleur's passing and Carey Price entering the NHL support program. Now, firstly, of course, big condolences over to the Lafleurs once again. Carey Price entering the program, coming out of the program, playing a few games. There's a reason this guy went out there and won the Masterton Trophy for perseverance throughout this season. But then you get into the nitty-gritty stuff. Kent mentions that they have a choice to make at the first overall pick that they wouldn't necessarily have to make if they picked third or fourth, since other teams make those choices for you. He talks about whoever they pick at number 1, that they need to be careful, protect this guy, and make sure he assimilates well to the city and to the organization. Hughes mentions that the current roster of players can help dictate what they should do as an organization to help the first overall pick. He mentions that he talked to Carey Price in particular, asking him what they thought he should do with the first overall in terms of dealing with the pressure to be the future face of the franchise, because you gotta remember Carey Price was a top pick as well. Kent Hughes asked Carey Price to look back on his experience and what went well for him, and also what Price thought the organization could do better to protect a young star wearing the Habs logo. So, firstly, I like what Kent Hughes said at the beginning, where it's like, okay, the fact that we're drafting first means that we don't necessarily have a slam dunk choice, because if you're drafting third or fourth overall, hey, guess what? You don't have a choice. Shane Wright, Logan, Cooley, and Slafkovsky are all going to go off before you end up picking, which means you just take the next guy available, like Simon Nemec or Jiricek or whoever else. But if you're first overall, you have that open field. You have to make the choice yourself. Also, it goes without saying, but it's good that Kent Hughes is thinking about, okay, this player that we draft, we have to make sure they adjust to the city properly. We're going to get Carey Price on here because he was also a top pick, and give Carey's insight as to what the Canadiens can do and not do to make this first overall picks environment all the more positive. Kent also says they haven't made a decision on who they're picking. And that might come as a surprise to many people because, oh my gosh, that means they're going to think about Slafkovsky. This is what Frank Seravalli said. He asked him if watching his son Jack Hughes for so many years growing up could affect who they're drafting based on being more familiar with some of Jack's teammates and opponents. Kent answers he would always be more comfortable drafting a player that he is familiar with and knows what they can do over the next 2 or 3 years based on what he saw, versus being great over one tournament or the span of a few weeks. Keep that thought in the back of your mind as we read this next quote. Although the fans would love to see the first overall pick play in Montreal next season, Kent Hughes says they aren't going to pick who they think will be good in their teens, aka now, but they're going to pick who's going to be the best in their mid-20s. And so, if you're talking about Kent Hughes saying, yeah, we're not going to pick a guy just because he had a really good few weeks or a really good tournament, and we don't want to pick a guy who's the best player today, we want to pick a guy who'll be the best player in the future. Slafkovsky is a guy that kind of has that reputation. Fantastic Olympic Games showcase this season. Pretty good stint internationally for Team Slovakia. That in itself is kind of a combination of a few weeks that pushed up his draft stock to incredible lengths. Meanwhile, Shane Wright has been scouted on and potentially first overall worthy for the past 3 years, so this is a player in Shane Wright that has had the spotlight on him for such a long time. Plus the fact that some scouts go out there and question the high upside projectability of Slafkovsky versus that of a Shane Wright. Sure, Slafkovsky scored a boatload of points at various international tournaments, but Shane Wright didn't get those same opportunities. In fact, when he played for Team Canada at the U18s last year as a 16-year-old, he was really good. And people still acknowledge that Shane Wright's ceiling is astronomically high, and it's always been that way. So Kent Hughes, without saying it directly, is pretty much going with the idea that, yeah, they're going to take players that have been projected to being good for a while, and they're not going to let 2-3 week stints on other players influence their decisions and push those players that had those stints above others. Even though he says verbatim that he doesn't know who they're going to pick yet, I think we can kind of fill in the dots ourselves. He mentions that teams have a tendency to overanalyze players when it gets close to the draft. Kent Hughes said they're looking for a player that has the highest ceiling and who has the skills to differentiate themselves at the NHL level versus junior. Maybe that's a little bit of a stretch here, but Slafkovsky did not play junior hockey. He was playing pro Finnish hockey. That's not junior technically. Shane Wright, on the other hand, did play junior. Kent also mentioned how proud he is of his son Jack and hopes that the team that drafts him won't be the team that picks right before the Habs or right after, so we can savor the moment of seeing his son get drafted into the NHL. I think what Kent Hughes is saying is that he's probably not going to draft his son, which is a sentiment that we have seen over the past few months here, so I don't really think that should be too surprising. He says the process on draft day will be dynamic. The Canadiens might move up. They might trade picks for next year's draft. The Habs have 10 picks in the first 4 rounds of this draft, and as we've discussed, that is a boatload of picks. The fact that you have 14 total picks in one draft is bananas because you can't realistically draft 14 players and expect them all to get entry-level contracts by the time 2025 rolls around, for example. So you're gonna have to probably leverage some of that capital into other assets elsewhere. Maybe next year draft picks, maybe players that can help you out immediately, either in Laval or in Montreal this season. Hughes also says that the Carey Price status is not really updated. He had a small procedure on his left knee in the postseason, and they're waiting to see how his knee reacts. Kent also reiterates that they are trying to out a team together that can win, they can put a team together, that can win on a consistent basis year after year. He doesn't think the team is as bad as it was, and the biggest thing that hurt them the most this season was the man games that ended up being lost. He mentions Pittsburgh and Boston being role model teams on how to build their own squad. He says that the hardest thing about being an NHL GM is all the non-hockey components, so I'm guessing financials, I'm guessing people stuff, and managing other organizational parts that are not really related to the on-ice product. He says the analytics department will also be the cornerstone of the organization and how to build a roster and develop players. It's a big move from the previous administration. Now, the Colorado Avalanche have just won the Stanley Cup, and Joe Sakic went out there and pretty much said that analytics played a very big part in how that was done. We also know that the Tampa Bay Lightning the previous few seasons have been run on analytics too, and so learning that the Montreal Canadiens will be making the shift over to the analytical side of the game is a pretty good sign in my opinion, but of course you can go out there and disagree in the comments if that is the case. But also, talk to me as well in general about what you think about Kent Hughes and his comments on the draft. What are your thoughts on the sort of cryptic and maybe two-sided way he talked about the first overall pick and who they're going to use the pick on, how he wasn't necessarily too conclusive, but how at the same time he kind of pointed the arrows in a direction that I think most people can understand. Also, talk to me in the comments, what do you think about Jack Hughes? Do you think Kent Hughes is going to draft his own son on draft day? If I had to place a bet on it, I'd probably say no. But just knowing that Jack Hughes is going to get drafted somewhere, I think it's a pretty interesting thing. If New Jersey goes out there and picks this dude, then man, that'd be kind of funny, wouldn't it be? But either way, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Slafkovsky, Cooley, Wright, first overall, trade up, trade down, the Montreal Canadiens, interview with Kent Hughes. The article is going to be in the description of the quotes as well as the video, so go ahead and check that out. I hope you enjoyed this video. JURAJ SLAFKOVSKY, and bye.